Good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. And in this video I just wanted to kind of touch on why I feel personally pugs or pugging as a concept in World of Warcraft is failing. Or at least from my perspective is failing, and one of the reasons, or the main reasons why I believe this is the case, is because pugging in World of Warcraft is inherently kind of being suffocated by the toxicity slash the impatience of the WoW endgame community. And this is a little bit different across both Mythic Plus and across raiding, but in general I'll be talking about both communities in this video. And obviously the video title can be perceived to be quite invasive, why you could be the problem with your pugging group. But this is something I believe applies to all World of Warcraft players. And I want to start firstly with what is pugging. So pugging, obviously, for those who don't know, is public grouping, essentially. Basically, you go into a dungeon finder or the pre-made group of dungeon finder. So instead of having your group allocated by the dungeon finder, you will create your group. So you will start a group or join a group, and that group will form itself. The leader will choose people of an appropriate item level, or in the case of Mythic Plus, their rating will be displayed. And from the people that apply, you can select people for your party group. Now, a lot of people will link achievements, mention what they can do, item level will come into play here, and for Mythic Plus, Mythic rating will come into play. But there's no guarantee of the quality of player that you'll get. Some people could have purchased their heroic curve run, some people could have done it on an alt. Other people, for example, might be using a character that has a decent item level, but that decent item level could have been obtained from being carried themselves, same as their Mythic Plus rating. There's plenty of different factors that can be the reason why the group is maybe not, the item level or the choices you make could be misled. And the most common of these is generally either players are carried, they've bought their runs, or they're playing a class that, even though, yes, they cleared heroic on the Beastmaster Hunter that they've been playing for 10 years, but they're now playing a shaman, and so they're just not nearly as good on that shaman as they are on their hunter. But the thing is when the actual raids or when the Mythic Plus dungeons start, there's this big sense of expectation. Everyone expects everyone to know exactly what to do, which is fair, especially if you have mentioned that you want people who know the strats. But there seems to be a very low tolerance level for mistakes. And I understand that this is not something that is just tied to World of Warcraft. This is tied to most MMOs. Hell, this is tied to most games. Every time we have to interact with other people online, there's a sense of impatience. A lot of us only get a certain amount of time every day to play video games. For some of us, that could be an hour, 2 hours. For some people, it can be half an hour even. For some people, it's 2 hours every second night, much like myself. So it can be difficult in this scenario or in this situation when you feel like you're being pressured to using your time efficiently. And I understand that can be a concept that causes a level of impatience amongst people. But this impatience has gotten to the point where it becomes a hindrance to any kind of curvature that happens. I'll give you an example. In Korea, the top 10% are allowed to become teachers. And the reason why in Korea the basis is that only the top 10% can become teachers is because in theory they want some of their brightest and smartest to teach the next generation. And this makes some sense, to have the smartest among us teach the next group means that in theory the next group should be better. In WoW, think of this as a reverse effect. The top 10%, the best players in the game, don't wish to interact with the other 90% at all. They don't want to interact with the other 90% in any way, shape, or form. They don't want to teach them anything. They don't have the patience to teach them anything. And if you're not within their guild structures or directly interacting with them in a social aspect, most times, most players are locked out of super hard content. To do Mythic raiding, for example, is incredibly locked out. to do anything above a Mythic 14 pugging or a Mythic 15 pugging is incredibly difficult. It is possible, of course, but it's incredibly difficult. And that's because, and I believe this should be the case, there is a large social preparation and practice aspect to being good at the highest level of the game. But the problem is that although I believe that this is good in a sense that the highest level requires some of the highest commitment, the problem is that outside of that commitment, it leaves very little time to teach the rest. So what happens is you get the people just below that top level, people that are a little bit better than I am. I'm a 1,800 or so Mythic Plus player. I've done heroic rating. I'm not a great player of World of Warcraft. I would say I'm maybe above the average. And the problem is you get a lot of people like me that are left with the task of introducing other players to newer aspects of World of Warcraft. But there seems to be this prevailing sense in the community that we don't have time to teach the new people. We want to effectively use our time. We don't want to fail or wipe raids. We don't believe we should. And I understand this again to a point, as I mentioned earlier. But the big thing is it's become so pervasive into the community that people leave after one single attempt. There's not a single, even remote attempt from people within the community to try and essentially stay and teach newer members of the community. And this leads to a very large skill gap and a very limited pool of players, because what's happening is people are becoming more and more reluctant to teach or to accept failure. And every time this occurs, people that are maybe trying the content for the first time or trying to get into the content tend to fall away. And when people fall away, your skill gap becomes smaller. Think of it like the scenario with the Koreans. Should, for example, they reduce the amount of people teaching from 10% to 6% to 5% to 4%. Yes, you will have very, very good 4%, but you will have a lot few teachers to choose from. And in turn, with few resources or fewer kind of, abilities to teach, you can teach fewer students. By teaching fewer students, you have less people to potentially become teachers in future. And this is kind of the knock-on cyclical nature that affects the World of Warcraft endgame community through its pugging. Like, yes, you've now avoided having to run the boss for the second time, or you've avoided possibly failing a key, but what you've also done is you've potentially turned one or two people away from doing this content in the future. And if those people don't persevere or don't try to improve or don't try to get better at the game, then your pool of skilled players becomes smaller and smaller, and your endgame community becomes smaller and smaller. And interactions between the endgame community and the casual player base are what keeps an MMO feeling alive. Yes, rating is a small percentage of players that play MMOs. Mythic Plus, in WoW's case, is also probably a small percentage. But having people willing to embrace players that do normal raids or casual raiding is super important for keeping the game alive. If you remove these key cornerstones, you'll be left with a very top-heavy environment, and that's how you get MMOs that have 10,000 players, and 500 of them are new players, while the other 9,500 are just OP players that are just griefing or basically not providing a constructive ability into the game. And once you don't have enough new players, or once you don't have enough of a casual player base, your game's population will effectively die out or slowly begin to whittle. And now this will happen in every MMO game regardless. This is something that will always occur because there are new things, and people who are more dedicated to games tend to stay with those that they've spent a lot of time towards, whereas the more casual player base will always try to experience other games or new content or come back more infrequently. But the thing is with the toxic behavior that the pugging community displays, I believe this is going to end up being a very large hindrance to pretty much any kind of progress by the casual player base. I'll give you an example. I have someone in my guild who has recently returned back to World of Warcraft, and he is leveling a Death Knight. And one of our better players, who does Mythic 11s and 12s, who's a pretty decent warrior, took him into a Mythic 2, which is a very low difficulty, quite easy, quite chilled. Now he died to the first boss in that Mythic 2. Of course, he tried to do the mechanics, but he did fail. But the party managed to kill the boss. So the mage that was in the party at the time requested that they kick this new player for dying once and doing slightly subpar damage, to be honest, but to kick him, otherwise he would leave. So even though the party was still well on track and well on time, he wanted them to kick him, otherwise he would leave. The warrior obviously refused, but the mage then stuck to his word and left the group. So now you've done one boss, you've wasted approximately 8 minutes of your life, and everyone now has to leave and the key gets deranked. This is honestly just incredibly toxic behavior. And now I understand that people will say, well, you know, we don't want to finish keys out of time, we don't want to do these things. But there's a reason why Blizzard gives you loot when you finish a key, even if it's out of time. Because the premise is that you're still rewarded for getting it done. And yes, you may not get a mythic rating upgrade, yes, you may get a slightly lower key, but at the end of the day, you still get the chance at the loot. And this is kind of what Blizzard does, but I think they need to go even further. I think Blizzard needs to make a way for us to try and, I don't want to say punish, because punishment feels like negative reinforcement to negative behavior. People who are already toxic, being punished for being toxic, tend to just be more toxic. But there has to be some greater incentive for people to be positive, whether that's some kind of Blizzard mentor token, whether that's additional loot for not leaving, or additional roll chances, or something like that. There has to be a positive reinforcement mechanic to positive behavior. I believe in doing this, we'll be able to remedy the situation a little bit. But I would love to hear what you guys think personally about this situation. I think it's something interesting. Of course, these are just my thoughts, but as always, let me know what you guys think. But that's it from me. See you next time. Bye.